I'm Jared Smith from WebAIM, stands for Web Accessibility in Mind. We're a non-profit web accessibility consultancy based at Utah State University at the Center for Persons with Disabilities. We've been doing web accessibility work since 1999 and are just passionate about web accessibility. I'm going to be talking about broader aspects of accessibility, not just multimedia, even if multimedia really is what's your theme. I think there will be much here that is applicable and relevant to broader aspects of media. Especially when we consider that multimedia is no longer just video. It doesn't work, as Larry explained, with this little chip on a board. It doesn't work that way anymore. And that's really powerful, I think, if you consider the rich experiences of the web and the way that it can facilitate a very rich experience with multimedia. When we try to define accessibility, and this is not an easy term to define, we like to explain that accessibility is a continuum, meaning that it's a process. You can always become more accessible. And for engineers, that always makes them squirm a little bit, because they want to have something that they can do and consider to be done. But with accessibility, really, if your goal is 100% perfect, total, absolute accessibility, you really have failed before you've even begun. We have to define and quantify accessibility, and I'll talk about some ways of doing that. I think when we consider accessibility as this continuum, we can look at physical spaces and see a lot of analogies to web accessibility over time. When the ADA first passed for physical spaces, it required accessibility for public transportation, and a lot of activism and a lot of efforts to ensure accessibility to these, and initially this was very inaccessible. And we had some interesting, we had people that were building buses and running public transportation saying things like, why do we need to make our buses accessible to wheelchair users? Wheelchair users don't ride our buses. Of course they don't, because they can't. Sometimes I think generally we have moved beyond that on the web. We still do hear things like, well, we're a medical school, we don't need to worry about accessibility for people with disabilities. So I think generally we move beyond this step of the web. Next, for public transportation, we saw this stage of accommodation, where there's a forklift kind of lifting this person into a bus. Just the native environment didn't really support accessibility. We provided other mechanisms for that. And very often in higher ed, accommodation is very much a reality. There are some things you cannot make natively accessible. There will always be a role and place for accommodation. But sometimes it does tend to be delayed. Maybe it is not truly equivalent. Another thing we saw in public transportation often was a separate bus that was targeted only towards people with disabilities. And we might think of the connotation that often comes with the term of what we call that bus. Next in this progression, we saw retrofitting. So we take this cutting torch and cut a big hole out of the side of the bus and bolt on this hydraulic lift. And retrofitting is also a reality, and often that's where we're at when it comes to our web accessibility efforts. It's very often clunky, expensive, not very timely, but it is a reality, especially when we're dealing with accessibility now. We have accessibility problems today that we need to address. What our ultimate goal, though, is accessible design, universal design, building an environment that supports accessibility. Our buses in our where I'm from have accessibility built into them. Large ground level bottom floor, the bus will kneel, the ramp will automatically fold out. Just hit a button and the button will fold out, or the ramp will fold out to allow access really to anybody. And this has made an environment that's more accessible to everyone. And of course we see that in web design. If we consider traditionally when the ADA was first passed, to build an accessible building, you hire an architect and they would design this building, and then you had to hire your ADA specialist to come in and tell you, oh, you need a ramp here, you need to widen these doors. And to some extent, WebAIM and others are these ADA architects of the web that come in and say, oh, here's something you've designed and let's fix it. If you go to school today to become an architect, you generally just know how to design accessible buildings. It's part of what you do. And because of that, we see better environments. It's not perfect yet, but we don't see things like wheelchair ramps in new buildings very often anymore. They're designed with ground level entrances. And that's where we need to get on the web. Teach Access that Larry talked about is an initiative to get us to that point where our web architects of today and tomorrow are learning to build accessibility as part of what they do. So if we view this continuum and progression of accessibility over time, we do need measures of accessibility, and guidelines and standards help define those measures on this continuum. We have the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, version 2.0, or WCAG the way that I will pronounce that. These guidelines are a good set of guidelines. How many of you are familiar with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines? By show of hands, almost all of you, great. Finalized in 2008, perhaps showing a little bit of age, but they were designed to be very principles-based and more technology-agnostic, which was wonderful. As technology changes, because these are more technology-based, they would have a longer shelf life. And they really have held up very well. The side effect of that is it uses kind of this ethereal, fuzzy, and sometimes confusing language that can sometimes be difficult to implement and to measure too, because we're dealing with technology. We have on the WebAIM side a checklist that takes a lot of the resources of the WCAG 2.0 and boils it down to a few pages that can be helpful of some of the main points to cover. And this is in the process of being updated. There's a draft, and there's I would put a strong emphasis on the word draft of WCAG 2.1 right now, but it's wonderful that progress is being made to update these guidelines. The 4 foundational principles of these guidelines are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And I think those of you that are familiar with WCAG probably understand and have heard these principles before. I think these principles are very applicable to multimedia accessibility. And as we consider these principles across what we're making accessible, we also need to consider various types of disabilities. While these are the foundational principles of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and really good principles to help us measure accessibility, I would propose that we maybe have a few initial steps that we should consider first. I think that content first needs to be useful. You know, if it's accessible but nobody visits or gains any benefit from it, who is it accessible to? Does it really matter? It needs to be useful, and it needs to be usable in a way that the user can really gain benefit from it. And then, if we focus on those 2 things first, then we can begin to focus on perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. There's a phrase that I like to use of web accessibility lipstick on a usability pig. Sometimes we'll have clients come to us and they say, oh, I've got this new whiz-bang thing I want to make accessible, and we'll look at it and say it's simply not usable. No amount of web accessibility techniques or lipstick is going to make this thing not a usability pig. So as we focus on usability first, accessibility becomes much easier, sometimes almost free. When we focus on the user experience first, the broad user experience, and then we consider the implications for individuals with disabilities. So very often we find that those really aren't all that different when we focus on user experience first. So as we view this continuum, your site can be compliant yet still inaccessible. Again, that makes people a little uncomfortable, especially when we consider that there are legal requirements for compliance. But, so we're always going to favor accessibility over compliance. Focus on the user experience. Use the guidelines as guidelines. Use them as a tool to help us better provide a user experience. To take this one step further, your site can be technically accessible yet functionally inaccessible. Consider for a moment, I just want you to think about your website or a site that you're very familiar with. Generally, a user with a motor disability might navigate using the keyboard. How many times would a user need to hit the tab key? The tab key will navigate through links and form controls. How many times would a user need to hit that key on your website from the very beginning of your page, maybe through navigation and search, maybe a sidebar before they get to the good stuff. I've seen pages with dozens, even hundreds. I think my record is 600 navigation items in a very complex drop-down flyout type menu. Technically accessible, yes. Functionally, is my friend who has paralysis, generally uses a stick in his mouth to navigate using the keyboard. Is he going to hit that key on his keyboard that many times, whatever number you came up with? Maybe not. So guidelines are intended to be pass or fail. They're not very good at measuring things like simple, understandable, efficient. They don't really go there, but that's such a critical part of the human and the user experience. So to go into a little more detail on these principles, first perceivable, we want the content to be perceived by the user to their senses in a way that they can use it in some way. If content is not perceivable, it doesn't matter what else it is. It will be inaccessible. We focused today on users with auditory disabilities, captions for video and live audio, text transcripts for all audio content, and then audio description. There was some discussion of that, and I applaud 3Play Media for their efforts on audio description. Audio description is required for level AA compliance with web content accessibility guidelines. It's very often misunderstood, often because of that fuzzy, ethereal, weird language. This is something historically as we have recommended that things that are going to result in the best accessibility. We generally recommend captions and transcripts, but audio description is increasingly becoming, I think, more of a requirement, and it certainly is beneficial for users with visual disabilities. There were some great comments in the panel about we need a stronger focus not just on captioning the media that we have, but the quality and instructional value of the media that's being produced. There's a lot of talk about volume. Are we creating volume because we can, or because it really is instructionally sound? When it comes to audio description, it was also mentioned in the panel, we need to just design media that avoids the necessity for audio description. Have any content that's presented visually, presented audibly. And if we think about that in our media design and educate those that are producing media, that significantly decreases the effort and cost and burden of creating audio description. I'm just going to really hit some high-level points on various disabilities with these principles. For those with visual disabilities, including blindness, low vision, and color deficiency, there are a lot of different types of assistive technologies that can be useful for those with visual disabilities, from screen magnification to that enlarges content for users with low vision, to screen reader technology, to high contrast, overriding page colors, and so forth. So, a few principles. It's important to provide sufficient contrast. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines have a complex formula that, based on a foreground and background color, will generate a contrast ratio. Then it defines thresholds based on that contrast ratio as to whether something passes or fails, whether it has what they consider sufficient contrast or not. We have tools, or many tools out there where you can analyze your site, put in color values to tell you where it's at when it comes to WCAG 2.0. It's also important that we don't rely on color alone to convey information or meaning. We can use color. Color is very, very beneficial for accessibility, but these 2 points are important for accessibility for those with visual disabilities. But common sense is vital when considering color contrast. There are a bunch of words up here in various colors. Some of these meet the WCAG requirements for contrast. Some of them do not. I'll just think for a moment as to which ones you think would pass and which ones you think would fail. And then the actual result. The first 4 all passed, the bottom 4 all fell. A few considerations here. What are those 2 colors in the middle? They look the same. Well, one is barely above the threshold, one is slightly below. Visually, you can't really tell the difference, but that is the way that guidelines work. They draw a line in the sand. In this side you pass, yay. In this side you fell, boo. But that is not how humans work. It's not like somebody with low vision would see this gray word pass and be able to read it perfectly fine and not be able to read anything below it. Humans are so much more dynamic and more variable the guidelines have to define. So we need to implement some common sense, consider the user experience. I've shown this slide to probably at least 10,000 people, almost universally. When I ask which one's the most visually distinctive, they say that red one at the bottom. There may be some consideration there for users with color blindness or color deficiency, with reds and oranges, but there may also be some misalignment of the guidelines and thresholds to actual human perception. That's some research that we'll be doing at WebAIM to get a better sense as to whether this formula is actually accurate, not only with human perception, but with modern displays and technology. Higher resolution, higher built-in contrast, things like that. Does it make a difference? And our users may be even more adept to doing this than they were in 2001 when this research was conducted on an Amiga 1000 computer to define these thresholds as they are in the current guidelines. When we consider visual disabilities, two key words that we focus on are structure and semantics. Those two S words are so important. So structure is the application and content structure to facilitate understanding and navigation, and are the semantics or the underlying meaning of things in our page, are those meaningful and accurate. So some things we can do: build a logical heading structure. Headings define the structure of your document. If you pull out just the headings of a document, they should serve as a table of contents. These facilitate understanding. If you're like me, when I come to a big long document, I scroll real fast and I look for big bold text. The bigger and bolder the text, the more important I generally know that section is. But you can provide that same functionality and structure and semantics or meaning to users with visual disabilities by providing a good document heading structure that describes those sections of the page. You can also define regions or ARIA. I'll talk about ARIA in just a minute. A way to define the main content area of a page, the header, the footer, the sidebar, the navigation, the search area of a page to facilitate quick navigation. Those are things that we do visually. Come to a new page we are in. Okay, here's search, there's the navigation, here's the main content, there's some ads over there, we'll never look at those again, right? We orient to a page visually, and we can define those same types of semantics and structure to someone that can't have that visual orientation to provide programmatic navigation through those. Of course, there's alternative text. Right? Rule number one of accessibility. The two key terms that we use to help people understand alternative text are content and function. What is the content of the image? And if the image has a function, you can click on it. Very often, what we see instead is a description of an image. So if there were a photo of me in a web page, the content of that image would probably be my name, as opposed to a description of strong, dashingly handsome. Maybe would not be equivalent. But you can see that how the description of an image can be significantly different from the content. We need to think about our alternative text processes and who it is that's determining alternative text. Very often they're chosen or designed and then thrown over a wall to a developer who then very often will author the description of the image. Good, meaningful linked text that describes the function of that link, so it's clear by the link text its own, all by itself. Associating form labels to form controls. If you don't understand the code stuff up here, don't worry about it. Just keep in mind the principles of when I see a first name field, I visually associate the word's first name to the form control. Someone that's blind can't make that visual association, so we need to provide a programmatic, under the scenes, under the hood in the code of our page, an association between those elements. Making sure that things have that the function of elements, especially buttons, are well defined. Associating data cells to row or column headers. I can look at a piece of data and visually scan up or down, left or right to determine what that piece of data is. Someone that's blind can't make that visual association, so we can do that in our code so that a screen reader can identify what a piece of data is based on its headers. A good page title, very important for accessibility. One of the first things read by a screen reader when it encounters a web page. I also want to define the document language. This is one technique that's very often overlooked. Many of us are dealing with multilingual users, and if the document language is not defined and the primary language of the screen reader user is different from the language of that page, or if the document language is defined incorrectly, it can be very significant. I'm just going to let you experience this. Hopefully this will come across here. Here's some text in English. It will be read by a screen reader thinking that it's actually a different language. I don't think I need to say anything more about that, because how important this is. And it's 9 or 10 characters in our code. It's entirely behind the scenes. Very important also for transcription. Really important to define that, especially where we can translate content automatically. Now, I used the term ARIA before, so I want to get into ARIA a little bit more. Really, this kind of ARIA is the Accessible Rich Internet Applications. It's a specification by the W3C for accessibility. ARIA, I like to say it paves the cow paths, if you understand that metaphor. I grew up on a farm in Idaho, and cows take the path of least resistance from point A to point B. The same can be said of university students. So come over here to Harvard Yard, and you can see what I mean. You can see this photo where the students have cut it. It's right by our offices on campus to save 2 or 3 seconds getting to class, how they cut that corner. This is a photo I took by our main library. And every year they put up like posts and a rope and a sign that says, "Please don't walk on the grass," and it's a matter of minutes, and there's a trail that goes around. Shortly after I took this photo, I noticed this construction going on here. I thought, wow, what are they adding on to the building? What are they doing? Here you can see the reverse shot of that trail that goes right into the construction site. And when they were done, this is what they built. Why do you think they built this? Get off my lawn, kids. That's all I can think of. That's the only thing I can think of. And now I see the students, they just jump over it and go across the grass. This is the antithesis of paving the cow paths. This is inhibiting the natural user behavior. It used to be that sometimes people would come to us with something new and innovative that they were building and designing, and they would say, we want to make this accessible, and we would have to say, there's just not a way to do that. Current accessible technologies just don't yet support that. And that's one of the ways we can reformat or restructure this, maybe simplify it, or provide an alternative version. And ARIA has really now paved that path to innovation. It's very rare that we have to say that anymore. So that's really the power of ARIA, is with modern, especially applications on the web and the support for new and innovative accessibility. I talked about semantics, and things in HTML, the things we use on the web have native or built-in semantics. A button, the screen reader knows that a button is a button. The web page, the browser tells them that a link is a link, a table is a table. So we don't want to use those things. Use the tools that we have at our disposal to define things correctly. And when that falls short, then and only then can we use ARIA, which really leads us to rule number 1 of ARIA, which is don't use ARIA. And that sounds a little absurd, but it's almost written just that way as the first rule of ARIA in the specification itself. It says that if you can build it and make it accessible using the technologies that are available in HTML or whatever technology you're using, then you must. And when you can't, then ARIA can help bridge that gap or pave that path to that innovation. So I mentioned I grew up in Idaho. I'm a child of the 80s, and like that box that Larry showed with the knob on it, that was our TV. We had 4 channels. One of those channels was not Fox. And much to my parents' dismay, I had an aunt that every few months she'd send us a box with VHS tapes with The Simpsons. And I can remember in one episode, Homer makes a toast to alcohol. And with a little tweak, I think it's applicable to ARIA. So it's our toast to ARIA. the cause and solution to all our accessibility problems. While the power and potential of ARIA is very significant to enhance accessibility, the reality is that it's doing just the opposite. Reaches of abuse, misuse, overuse, it's very often implemented incorrectly, and it's resulting in things that are less accessible. In much of our consultation recently, we spent more time telling our clients how to stop using ARIA than telling them how to start using it correctly. We've seen applications, if the only thing that they did is remove all of this new extra ARIA markup, it would be more accessible. And that's discouraging as someone that sees that powerful potential for enhanced accessibility. So, just a caution to you, even if you're not building code in ARIA, consider what's happening there. Really what ARIA does is it changes or enhances the default semantics of things we already have on the web to API values. So an API is the communication between the browser and the system technology. It just changes that communication to things the screen readers already understand. So an example is a slider. We see sliders on the web. We see those in applications where you can click and drag something. But there's no slider tag or element. I'm doing my geeky HTML game signs up here. My brackets. There's no slider element in HTML. There's no way to just build that. So we hack it together with scripting and CSS, and we use all this stuff to kind of hammer together and build this slider that works and is interactive and has the functionality that we want. How nice would it be if we just had the vocabulary in HTML to define slider? Well, screen readers and other assistive technology, they understand the language of slider, and they have forever. If you open, if you go to a screen reader in software on your system and go to a slider, it will tell you what's a slider, it will tell you what the minimum and maximum values are, what the current value is, and how to interact with this thing. The problem is we don't have the language in HTML until now. With ARIA, it allows us to enhance those semantics, it allows us to define that something is a slider and what those appropriate values are. But in order for that to work, we have to use it correctly. And that goes back to that foundational rule of ARIA, making sure that we're using it correctly. A lot of the recommendations that we see with clients can be boiled down to just use a button or a link or a select menu or whatever it is that they're trying to build. Just do it. We have it already available to us in HTML and web design that just use the standard control. So maybe in an evaluation report that we do with a client, if they've used this, what we might call a pseudo button, it's just this thing that's clickable by the mouse but doesn't do anything else. There's no semantics there, there's no keyboard accessibility. So our recommendation will be just use a button, and if you don't, here's a page and a half of technical things that you have to do in order to make this thing that's not a button actually work and function like a button for assistive technologies. Okay, moving on to operable. Once we can perceive our content, we want to be able to interact with it. We want to use it. Many types of disabilities, many types of assistive technologies here. This is a photo of a courthouse down in Florida. Does anybody notice anything interesting about the accessibility of this entrance?
I don't see it.
So there's actually a wheelchair ramp here. On the left-hand side, there's a wheelchair ramp that takes you right to the landing in the middle of the stairway. There's another view of that. Did somebody consider accessibility when they built this entrance?
Partially.
I would say yes. They built a ramp, and a very long one, at probably great expense. Someone probably had a checklist somewhere, wheelchair ramp. Yep, got one of those. They didn't really consider the user experience, the user process. Maybe the view's really nice up there, I'm not really sure. But how frustrating would that be in a wheelchair to get up there? Initially, there's this perception of accessibility. There's this thing that presents that accessibility would be there, and then the reality is that there's suddenly this barrier. I showed this just a couple months ago. I mentioned my colleague that has paralysis, who uses a stick in his mouth. He uses a motorized wheelchair. He saw this slide and he said, well, I was recently in this very large city, and there was this very large street I was going across, and I hit the button for the crosswalk and went down the curb cut, which is there primarily for accessibility. We know the additional benefits for everyone of curb cuts. went across 6 lanes of traffic and got to the other side and there was no curb cut. And here he was stuck in traffic. And so this is, again, was this perception of initial accessibility, but the entire user process hadn't been considered. So when we think of operability in all aspects of accessibility, we need to think of the entire user process, the user flow. Sometimes we start with the most popular pages, and that's great. Those are the ones that people are going to interact with most. But that, that final step of a critical process isn't going to be highly visited, but is pretty important to the success of that process or function on your site. So we want to make sure that things are keyboard accessible. For sighted keyboard users, it's important that we have what's called a focus indicator or an outline. As I navigate through the page by hitting that tab key, I need to be able to see where I'm at within the page. I need to make sure that interactive elements are clearly distinguishable, not only to keyboard users, but touch users on mobile. You need to know what it is you can interact with. We need to build in efficiencies, allow users to quickly get past their navigation and jump right to the main content, and ensure a logical reading and navigation order. Fortunately, keyboard accessibility is pretty easy to test. Take your mouse, put it away. Can you navigate to everything using the keyboard, and does it make sense? Unfortunately, the prevalence and significance of keyboard accessibility issues is on the rise. If you had asked me 10 years ago something I thought we would have had figured out by 2017, I probably would have said keyboard accessibility. And I think with modern applications and rich content, that sometimes that's not a reality. I think there's some interesting implications with media there too. Somebody on the panel mentioned multiple disabilities. Motor disability with an auditory disability, for example, and the efficiency not only of the content, but navigating and operating within that content. We want our content to be understandable. We need to make sure that the messages that we're conveying are accurate and accurately understood by a user. This affects users with cognitive and learning disabilities, which is by far the largest disability group, likely larger than all of the other disability groups put together. At higher ed, I think if you have access to the data, for your campus, you would probably see that. But it's also something that impacts everybody. We're all impacted by things that we have difficulty understanding. So some principles here. Want to be careful with movement or other distractors. That little animating banner ad on your page might be mildly annoying to you. It may render the page entirely inaccessible to someone with high levels of distractibility. That carousel image, very often that's above the fold, most significant thing on a home page. In many ways, these can be a perfect storm of inaccessibility and usability, but that automatic animation can be really significant for many users. We want to simplify and be consistent. I probably shouldn't say too much more about that. These are things that are hard to define in accessibility guidelines, and they don't really go there. There's very little in the guidelines that help define simple. Avoiding small text, not like teeny tiny, but we've done research at WebAIM and have found that users with cognitive and learning disabilities really struggle with smaller text. Avoiding long line lengths, the number of characters per line. This is also something that we tested at WebAIM. And we had 3 samples of text. One was short line lengths, so there's a lot of overhead in going back to the next. So you're spending a lot of time going back to the beginning of the next line. Medium line lengths, average, and then long line lengths, where there's a lot of overhead in tracking back to the beginning of the next line, where you might lose track of where you're at. You might skip a line or go back to the line that you just read. So we did some testing with students with cognitive and learning disabilities. We timed them and we found that the medium line length one was the fastest, then the short line length, then the long line length. We'd also asked them about their experience, and when we were done, we said, well, which of these do you think was the most difficult? And almost universally, they said the one with the short line lengths. And we said, well, it wasn't on the stopwatch. It wasn't the most difficult for them. So we said, well, why? They said, because it was longer. Brought up an interesting question. It wasn't longer. We accounted for character and word count. It just looked longer. And that's something we saw consistently across our research, is the perception of difficulty tends to impact actual difficulty. We've probably experienced that. I do that every time I go to buy a plane ticket, right? I'm like, oh boy, here we go. I'm going to You just have this historical basis that this is going to be difficult, and so it becomes difficult, maybe because it's perceived as being that way. Compare that to maybe like an Amazon.com checkout flow. Pretty complicated. There's an awful lot there that they've broken it into these chunks that makes it pretty efficient and decreases that overall cognitive load, which is what much of this is about, is using design, using white space, simplifying content, chunking it into sections, and balancing cognitive load and functionality. If you consider your typical web developer team, right, this your typical web developer team, their corner offices and their pressed white shirts, their Mac hoodie, the Apple logo photoshopped out of it. The reality is that maybe most people that are building the web are highly adept at using it. They're pretty, I'm pretty geeky, right? You know, the vast majority of my work happens within a browser. I have a browser open all day long. You know, I carry browsers in my trousers, right? That's the same with me all day long. I know how to use the web. I've developed these conventions for using the web, these strategies, you know, for ads and search and navigation and orienting and all these things that I do on the web that not everybody has developed those or even can. So it's important that we step outside of our own experience and consider what the experience might be for others, especially those with cognitive and learning disabilities. Anytime you have to think, anytime you have to remember, anytime you experience frustration, magnify that by 1,000. Just think of that. What would it be like if this were 1,000 times more frustrating? Would the user disengage? What would that do to our users? That may be the experience of some users with cognitive and learning disabilities. And then our final principle is robust. Robust deals with technology strength, making sure that things actually work in the technologies that are utilized by our end users. And this is a big one. There's only 2 things in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, but I think it's really big. We have to make sure that it actually works. Media accessibility is certainly very relevant here. Doesn't matter what effort you put into your video player, if I can't use it on a mobile device, for instance, there's going to be some difficulty there. So our 4 principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. I haven't really mentioned age-related processes. This certainly applies there. The age of learners on the web is significantly increasing. You know, as we age, we tend to lose visual function, tend to lose audio function, we lose motor function, and we lose our minds. There's certainly loss of cognitive function as well. This is one thing that really motivates me in the work that I do, is that really by making the web more accessible today, I'm making it more accessible for my future self. We want to, now going back to that concept of accessibility being a continuum, and us having thresholds and measures along this continuum, some things to consider when evaluating or testing web accessibility. First of all, because accessibility is about the human experience, only people can evaluate true accessibility. There certainly is a place and a role for tools, for automated tools to do testing and checking of your content, but they're very, very limited. Of the 36 success criteria in WCAG 2.0, the requirements in WCAG 2.0, I think there are 2 that can definitively be tested as being true or false. Absolutely, it can tell you true or false with an automated tool. It's quite limited. That's not to say that tools aren't valuable. They can be helpful to really do 2 things. One, to give you a bird's eye view of where you're at when it comes to accessibility, and also to facilitate human accessibility. You might also use a checklist to help make sure you've covered all your bases. We have checklists on the WebAIM site that can help you just make sure you haven't missed something important, such as document language. If you built an English page, you speak English, you're testing in an English screen reader, it might be easy to not catch if there's a mismatch, for instance, in language. Perform keyboard testing. Put that mouse away. Make sure you can test it with your just using your keyboard. Testing in a screen reader does not have to be overly complex. You can do some basic testing. Even with a mobile device, fire up your screen reader, just listen to the page. Does it make sense? Is all of the non-text content conveyed? Conducting user testing also does not have to be overly complex, but very important to actually test with users with the real caveat and understanding that there is no typical user with disabilities. There's no typical screen reader user, and so be cautious and careful sometimes with the feedback, especially of one. And of course, automated tools can be helpful. At WebAIM, we've developed the WAVE tool. If you're familiar with WAVE, it's a fully free tool. We have built it to work the way that we think about accessibility to facilitate our evaluation of web content. It focuses really on facilitating human evaluation by revealing underlying accessibility information. I talked about semantics and structure. Much of that is hidden. It's embedded in your page. It doesn't show up visually. WAVE takes that content and presents it so you as a human with some gray matter can look at it and get a better sense for accessibility. And it helps to teach about accessibility along the way. Now, there are a lot of accessibility automated tools that are out there. We're certainly biased towards WAVE because we built it. That doesn't mean it's not the best. Just in conclusion, I want to end with this quote. For people without disabilities, technology makes things convenient, whereas for people with disabilities, it makes things possible. It's pretty incredible that we can all get our education online, right? We can engage with multimedia in these really powerful ways. That's really convenient, but for many people with disabilities, this is their reality. This is the way in which they can engage in educational resources in any way that's truly meaningful to them. So you have great potential to go out and really significantly impact the lives of people with disabilities. With that, I will say thank you.